Well, Joe, thanks so much for joining today. I'm really excited about this conversation. I've had the chance to hear you speak at a bunch of things, and I think you're one of the smartest and most incisive folks on energy right now. So I think we're in for a great conversation. Um, I'm Nat Cohen. I'm the president of the Center for Climate and Energy Solutions. We're a NGO focused on climate and energy based in DC. And one of the pleasures we have is working with a lot of businesses like Constellation. So let me start actually just by sort of stepping back a little bit on the business side, because you all made a big splash earlier this year. I know you're working through this when you announced that Constellation was going to be buying Calpine. That also has a lot of impacts and implications for our conversation around energy. So maybe start there, give a little bit of a sketch for folks who don't know about Constellation, what you are doing, and what it looks like once you have Calpine as well.
Yeah, well, thanks for hosting me this morning. Thanks to Harvard Salata Institute, and it was great to follow the governor. I'll just talk a little bit about Constellation. By the numbers, Constellation is the largest publicly traded nuclear company in the world. So we have, relatively speaking, about a quarter of the nation's nuclear plants we own. We also own renewables, hydro, and a relatively small amount of gas. And the transaction that Nat is talking about is earlier this year, we announced the largest acquisition ever in the history of our sector, where we bought Calpine. Calpine, by the numbers, is the largest natural gas fleet in America, the largest geothermal fleet, and pretty significant capabilities in storage. And what we will form together is the largest power generating company in the world from a publicly traded standpoint. Russia and China have bigger corporate entities, but they're obviously not publicly traded. But we will have the power output that is capable of powering Mexico, for example, on an annual basis. So it's really exciting. And what drove us to that decision is to create the scale to deal with this booming demand we're seeing from AI, quite frankly, and electrification of other parts of the business. And as we started to look at what our customers needed, they needed a company that had a nationwide footprint, could do business in every state, and had capabilities across the energy generation landscape. And I guess the other thing we were excited about with Calpine is the things we thought they were leading in. From a technology standpoint, they were leading in natural gas with sequestration. So they were working very much with the Biden administration on developing the nation's first retrofits for natural gas that would take the tailpipe emissions, get to CO2, and pump it into the ground where the geology makes sense. So a lot of exciting things to work with Calpine. It's a fantastic company. We look forward to getting the deal done, hopefully in the fourth quarter.
So largest private power generator, privately owned power generator in the world. That's something. So let me also, you've got a really interesting mix of technologies, and we talked a little bit about this before, but I want to get into it. We'll talk about policy and AI and all these things, but again, kind of set the table for folks who aren't 24/7 thinking about energy. I think a lot of people, when they think about clean energy, zero carbon energy, they think about wind power, solar. Many of us, you may have seen the wind turbines that are right behind the garage over there. And obviously wind and solar is important. That's played a really important role in helping push down emissions. You all, especially with Calpine, have this really interesting portfolio of other carbon-free technologies or low emissions technologies. You mentioned nuclear, traditional nuclear fleet. I know you all are thinking about advanced nuclear. You mentioned geothermal is super interesting. And so say a little bit about sort of what does that new mix of clean energy sources look like today, with some of those new technologies coming online?
Yeah, for us, it always begins with what's the customer you're going to serve. And so I mentioned a moment ago, we think AI is going to change the energy landscape from a consumptive demand standpoint. So what's the characteristic of that? They were building the most expensive machines ever built in the history of the world. I'll give you a little bit of a factoid here. The Manhattan Project, which we all know about, was a $2 billion endeavor, and it mobilized laboratories around the US to build the atom bomb. If you were to put that in today's economic terms, that would be roughly, depending on the discount rate you use, something like a $60 to $70 billion project in today's dollars. The data centers that we are building with individual clients exceed that amount. And the chips, the NVIDIA chips predominantly that are inside of them depreciate very rapidly. They decay with the rate of innovation, right? So those chips are state of the art for a relatively short period of time. Think about a depreciation schedule of about 5 to 6 years before the next chip is more important. What's that mean? It means if you own it and you spent $70 billion building it, you're going to run it 24/7. In fact, you want to maximize the output all the time you can. So what's that cause you to, if the principal consumptive need is electricity, what's it cause you to think about the electricity that needs to be the mirror image of that demand? It's got to be a 24/7 resource, right? So what we were pivoting towards is carbon-free technology that had the capability to run reliably. And I marvel at the governor's enthusiasm, and I think it's fabulous. And I think we need to tie into that. But if I were to quibble with her, and perhaps only at the margins, yes, clean energy, wind and solar are cheap for an incremental megawatt. But if I were to ask the question a different way, what is the cheapest zero-emission technology that could be counted on to operate every one of the 8,760 hours of the year, regardless of weather, regardless of any other consideration? You may not reach the conclusion that renewables with battery storage, for example, are the best solution. That's what our analytics told us. Our analytics told us that there would be space in this ecosystem for resources like natural gas plants with sequestration that had the benefit of being able to be dispatchable. We turn them on when we want them to be. Or nuclear plants, which run 24/7 and have demonstrated capability of being the most resilient power generation resources this nation has ever built. So that's what we said. We said, look, we want to meet the needs of our clients for renewables, and we build a tremendous amount of renewables. But we also wanted to pivot and recognized what we believed was a gap both in policy and intellectual space in this area around the need to be reliable, and especially if the fastest growing sector of your economy was a demand profile that needed that reliability and needed that 24/7 capability. That's what we did at Constellation. We started as the 23rd largest company by market capitalization 4 years ago when we spun from Exelon. We spun from Exelon because Exelon no longer believed the nuclear business was viable. I put my hand up and I said, I want to run that company. And in 4 years, we've grown our stock price by 700%. And we've gone from the 23rd largest by market capitalization to the second largest, and I hope soon to be the largest company in the world by market capitalization. So the point wasn't the magic of the CEO or the management team, but recognizing that we had this fundamental gap in the way we were approaching sustainability, and it would become especially acute at a time where the growing demand was going to be 24/7. That's kind of the secret sauce here. I mean, it's in retrospect, kind of it was pretty obvious, but it wasn't at the time.
Thanks a lot.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah,
So
wow.
I guess I love that story, and I love and I think that's an amazing bet that you made to raise your hand. I think it also traces the story of the growth of the need for carbon-free energy and all those kinds. And I know you think about it as where can you meet the need. I think about it as 10 or 15 years ago, the only game in town for carbon-free energy. Well, there was the nuclear fleet, obviously, and then there was, if you were building new, it was just wind and solar, and that always had the problem: the sun doesn't shine all the time, the wind doesn't blow. Now as you all have in you've got the ability to capture the emissions from natural gas. You've got geothermal. If we have time, let's dig into that, no pun intended. I think that drill into that may be better. But you also have battery storage and so on. So we've been talking about carbon free. Obviously, I've got climate in my name as an organization. I know you are really committed to that as a company. But we've also seen in the last year or so, obviously, a lot of the conversation around energy has shifted towards reliability, affordability. The governor mentioned affordability. Obviously, that's on a lot of people's minds. I know that's on your minds. And yet, it's also really vital that we continue to think about the climate and clean energy and zero and reducing emissions. I always say, you probably heard me say this before, climate is not a fad. It is driven by physics and chemistry. And I don't know, I would say a year ago, like, I don't know, or a year and a half ago, if you asked me what the regulatory environment is going to be in a year, that's really tough to predict because there's such a difference between the current administration and the potential Harris administration. But if you ask me in 5 or in 10 or in 15 years, that's a bet I'll take every time, that we're going to be more concerned around climate as a society. There's going to be more focus on it, just because that's the direction of travel with it. So with that in mind, I'm really interested to think about how you, both in Constellation, and how do you see the electric sector kind of navigating that landscape? On the one hand, affordability is really important, reliability you mentioned, and maybe climate gets less press, gets talked about less in Washington, but it still remains important and core to your business model.
Yeah, look, I think it's important for a variety of reasons. First, we're dealing with some of the largest clients on the planet. You've heard us announce major deals with Meta, with Microsoft, and with others. I will tell you, the conversation in the room has not changed. Yes, these companies increasingly are using natural gas because there's not another technology that could support the growth. But sustainability continues to be an objective, and for all the reasons you described, this problem is not going away. I've talked to my board about this. Probably the one chart that shocked me: universities in the West did a fairly detailed analysis to understand kind of the travel of temperature change on the planet. And everyone who denies climate has always said, well, the world's temperature has moved around over eons, and that, of course, is true. But the last time it moved 6 to 8 degrees Celsius, it took about 8,000 years to do that. And what we are talking about is a 6 to 8 degrees Celsius move on the planet, effectively by the end of this century. And the models are telling us it's worse. So look, if you're a business person in this space, that's got to tell you that 10 years from now, this is going to be a more difficult conversation, because not only are politics going to change, but the environment, political and otherwise, are going to change. So I think that again, if you're building machines for the long haul, how are you dealing with this externality? Now, I started earlier by telling you I bought the largest natural gas fleet in the nation. But a different question, or perhaps a more nuanced question, is this: would I build the largest natural gas fleet in the nation? And I realize that you're going to have a good friend of mine, Scott Strasek from GE, the CEO of GE, come and talk to you later today. And undoubtedly, he's going to tell you about the boom in natural gas generators, and that's all true, of course. But it's a hard conversation to figure out what's the cost of that machine going to be 10, 15, 20 years down the road. Because when you build a machine like that, you got to pay it back in about 30 years, right? It's not all coming back into your wallet in 5. So you have to anticipate, what's climate regulation? Are you going to be stopped from emitting? Are you going to have some sort of carbon pricing mechanism that occurs? How do you value those externalities in a world where you think the problem becomes more acute? And then you have the underlying problem of how much will natural gas cost 10, 15 years out, especially as the country exports more and we start to see this integration of international LNG pricing with domestic pricing. So that becomes a really hard thing. One could say, look, I want to buy this stuff because I think I could buy it for a third of the price of building it new, and it's relatively new and I'll get the value. That's a shorter payback period. The long-term payback period, The things that I'm going to invest in are things like renewables with storage, like gas, but only in those areas where there's abundant gas and a geology that allows for sequestration. Hopefully the administration changes its mind and begins to support innovation in that space, because I do think it's critical. And of course, new nuclear. So that's where my brain is at about the future. And it's absolutely clear. I'm not moving on that.
Yeah, and I appreciate what you said, and I think when I talk to CEOs at other companies, and we've got a bunch on our business council. You mentioned Scott Strazek of GE. You mentioned a bunch of the hyperscalers, Meta, and so on. I also think of Dow, Jim Fitterling at Dow, and those companies, as you say, the companies that are thinking about building things that's going to be around in 10, 15, 20 years and where their business is. I think all of those companies are continue to be thinking about climate. They've got commitments they have to clean energy, and they're looking to continue on this.
Regardless of who's in the White House,
Exactly.
right? I mean, it doesn't matter who the president is. People are looking at business fundamentals and trying to predict future environments. And the bottom line is that, the president's going to serve for another 3 years, and then things are going to change again.
Exactly. So let's talk about Washington a bit and talk about the policy environment. And I'd love to hear your thoughts both on what we actually got over the summer. I'll say a little bit about that, but interested in your thoughts, but also what more we need. So first part on what we got in the summer, I'll just say, I think there's a general, certainly in my world, in the NGO world, in the nonprofit world, a lot of folks think that the reconciliation bill, the One Big Beautiful Bill Act, just got rid of everything that was in the Inflation Reduction Act of a couple years ago. Got rid of all the kind of clean energy credits, and that was true for wind, and it was almost true for solar. But there are actually a lot of zero carbon technologies that retained those credits. So that was actually a win that not a lot of people noticed, but it's really important for all the technologies you're talking about. And by the way, that was a Republican Congress where we had 0 Republican votes back in 2022 for the IRA. So this is a Republican Congress saying, yeah, we're going to affirm the need and the value of tax credits for a lot of the technologies you're talking about: geothermal, nuclear, advanced nuclear, battery storage, et cetera, and for the manufacturing of those. So that one, I'm interested in other things you see on what we got, but also looking ahead. The governor mentioned permitting and siting in Massachusetts. You mentioned the importance of building new. When we when we talk and look at studies, one of the obstacles to building new stuff, and of course it varies by geography around the country, but one of the obstacles is permitting, siting, building new transmission, and that's something where more federal policy is probably needed. So say a little bit about that. What did we get? What do you see that we got out of the budget bill, the budget law, and what more do we need over the coming year or two?
Yeah, with your permission, I'll almost start backwards. I agree with the governor on permitting reform. I think that happens, but if I were to handicap it, I would have handicapped it as more likely 3 or 4 months ago. The level of toxicity in Washington, I was down there this week. Again, I spent a lot of time there. But the level of distrust and, frankly, hatred, because I can't find a better word this morning, between the two sides, threatens to do things that even are in their mutual best interest.
And if I can, maybe, because we were talking a little bit about this, we often think about this as, the parties, and some of that is just the Republicans, Democrats. But when I talk to folks, and I think we were talking about this, you hear the same thing. Some of that trust issue is actually in Congress with respect to the administration, maybe, and a question of, hey, if we're gonna move on permitting reform, for example, maybe there's a deal in Congress that says, look, let's just open it up, make it easier to build clean energy as well as any form of energy infrastructure. Right. We need it all. And the folks who are looking for clean energy say, well, we think that's going to win out on economic grounds. But that deal only works if you're confident that the folks in the administration are going to apply that deal equally. And I think that's where the trust is broken.
Yeah, I totally agree. And, we'll see, but the trajectory is not good. And obviously, all of these events outside of the energy sector, what's happening in the media today and all of these things are further contaminating any kind of prospect of folks just working together to do the right thing, quite unfortunately. In terms of the big beautiful bill, which I understand is going to get renamed here, it I would describe it pretty much as you did. I think the level of kind of public outcry about what happened doesn't really match the text of the language. There is a pathway for projects that have been underway and will be completed before the end of the administration, kind of what we call under construction standards. But basically, if you started this stuff and you keep working on it, you'll get the tax credit. And then the question becomes, what does a future administration do with that? And historically, we've seen clean energy tax credits get pretty favorable treatment in things like reconciliation packages and other things, with the exception of this particular bill. So I think the bigger issue there, folks, isn't political will. It's the capability of the nation as we continue to take on debt to fund things with tax credits to the same degree that we have before. So if you were to say, Joe, some future Congress is going to reinstate these tax credits and that's going to be the political will, I would have to say, well, history is on your side. The wind tax credits were created some 30 years ago. They were designed to be phased out at least 7 different times, and each time there was a reason to renew them. We've seen the same thing with solar, and the durability of these things over time has been nothing short of miraculous. The question is the nation's economic ability to continue to do that, given the looming debt issues. You know, when we're talking about consensus estimates of a debt to GDP growing to 130% or 140%, and really the pressures becoming the elimination of social programs or tax increases that are about more than taxing rich people like me, but taxing the middle class, then compromises are going to occur. And I fear that mechanisms that are based in tax credits might show signs of cracking at that point. One interesting question is, does that invite a resumption of the conversation around the carbon fee, right? Because if what I am forecasting becomes true, that we're going to be cash starved, and that perhaps our sovereign dominancy in terms of the value of the dollar as this kind of worldwide currency starts to abate a bit, one might argue that there is a need to raise revenue, and a tax on carbon would do just that. And there are Republicans that kind of continue to believe that. So I think we're going to be in the Wild West. Short term, I don't think I think the economics of wind and solar remain pretty much as they were before, but it phases out. Nuclear, ironically, after having been ignored for decades from a policy landscape and frankly despised by some components of the Democratic Party, is now emerging as a consensus view on technology. It's the only thing that 100% of the Democrats voted for and 100% of the Republicans voted for. And actually, the scope of the tax credits for nuclear actually increased, as you know. So it's a pretty funny thing because I've been in the business for a long time. And for so many of those years, I thought, we're getting a pretty tough, bad rap. That was unfortunate. And we were never the most liked technology. We've always had this kind of elemental relationship with Republicans it's about national security and different things, but Republicans always liked nuclear, but not nearly as much as they loved the oil and gas sector. And Democrats have come to like nuclear, but largely because of the organized labor aspect, the fact that we employ just so many people, and of course the fact that it's emissions free now in a world where climate has become this imperative. But we are not number one for either side. So I'd like to run around to the management team and say, hey, it turns out it's great to be number 2 because we're like the only ones that kind of escaped some harm. So I think that's what's occurred here. Probably the thing that I worry about a little bit is Even the IRA anticipated the phase out of technology-specific tax credits in favor of a technology-neutral tax credit. Look, I don't care how you make electricity, as long as you make it emissions-free, we're going to give you the dough. And that thing is dead after a period of time. So, and it would have to resume, and it's quite costly. I mean, we're talking probably about $500 billion or more scoring over 10 years. So, look, I think it kind of comes back, and I think there is a world here where the states, you listened to the governor before I got up here, it's clear that Massachusetts is going to try to fill the economic void till what, and we've seen that in renewable portfolio standards around the nation, but the states are equally cash strapped or more.
Yeah. Maybe I'll share, that was great. I mean, maybe I'll share a couple of thoughts about the politics, and I want to go to AI because that's also kind of one of the most interesting parts about it. One thing, I'm really glad that you raised the issue of a carbon price or carbon fee. That's certainly something that C2S, my organization, and our predecessor, the Pew Center, has long been a champion of. We like to joke we have the eternal flame of carbon pricing we keep in the back room. We're about the only ones now, but I do think you're right. I mean, I think I continue to think, I mean, and I know there are some great political scientists in the room who would disagree with me, but I think that the politics of a carbon price will be impossible until it becomes inevitable. Because as you say, the fiscal pressures, the challenges we're going to have to find other ways of driving down emissions in a way that really applies across the economy, and the need for revenue, So we'll see, but we're actually already laying the groundwork quietly at C2ES to think about what it would take to lay the foundation. So maybe in 3 years or 5 years, we have a shot. The other thing I wanted to say, just briefly, reflecting on the politics, because we talked a little bit about the Congress. I think what I took away from the conversation in the IRA, around the big beautiful bill, around these all the tax credits around clean energy and which would be saved and which wouldn't. The strongest argument we had, because my team was up there a lot on the Hill. I know Constellation, you all work closely with us when we advocate up. The strongest argument we had as a community was the investment and the tangible economic benefits that we can see in districts and in states. And so we've had data, and this is a change, because 10 years ago, 15 years ago, when I started working on this issue, it was all hypothetical. It was, oh, this is going to be great. We're going to pass some climate law, and trust me, there's going to be this amazing innovation. I don't know what it's going to be yet, but it's going to be awesome. And that transition, yeah, it's going to be hard, but trust me. And that's really a hard sell for folks. Whereas now you've got battery storage plants being built. Obviously, again, Scott will be up here. You've got clean energy plants, not enough, but just enough to point them out to folks. And that was when we could make it a local argument, and a local argument about constituencies. That was where I think we gained a lot of credence and a toehold, including on the Republican side. And then when it got nationalized, and the White House weighed in, and it was all about sort of wind and solar, then that's where we got really a hard time. But that's where the headwinds were. But that gives me a sense of that's where the politics need to be, and that's something that I think not enough people really recognize, because that's a really important asset that we have.
Yeah, and I mean, to your point, 70% of the economic development around clean energy product, we were seeing this, was occurring in Republican congressional districts. And I thought for sure that wins the day at the end of it. But fidelity to the president actually wins the at the end of it for probably everything.
That was the tension. But again, where it was the technologies that weren't in that sort of eye of the storm, that's where those economic benefits, I think, really came through. So let's talk about a little bit about AI, and maybe we'll do this, and then I'll have the last question. But AI, you mentioned it right at the top, Joe, and we're both on the board of the Electric Power Research Institute. That's all anybody wants to talk about. A board meeting, summer seminar about a month ago in San Diego was all about AI, and for good reason, because we're seeing that demand. One thing I'd love to hear from you, you talked about sort of how that affects Constellation's mix and business model. But for folks who are, maybe they've read about, how real is that demand? How big is it? I know that some of the numbers you see are just enormous, but it is, how should we think about the size of that demand and what that means for the power sector going forward?
Look, I've spoken publicly about this. You're not going to be surprised. I think it's overblown 2 to 3x. In other words, what I'm seeing out there in the ecosystem is you got 5 big clients, maybe 6, but 5 big clients. You've got Microsoft, Meta, Google, you've got Amazon, and you've got Apple out there. Maybe you think Oracle and NVIDIA are kind of the next level clients here. And then you've got in this ecosystem probably 200 or 300 entities that are chasing those data center opportunities. And so it's the individual companies saying, hey, look, I'm going to build this $50 billion facility. I'm going to put my toe in the water in Texas, Pennsylvania, and Arizona, or whatever. I'm just picking states here. But to the utilities, because this is such a balkanized business, to the utilities, it looks like all 3 of those projects are real, right? You've got this big company saying they're going to invest. They're doing all the right things. They're putting study requests in to actually get the power. So I think you have this kind of multiples effect. And then when you get these kind of smaller players running around doing the same thing because they want to sell their projects to the data economy customers, then you've got these overblown estimates. Granted, stipulate to that, it's still going to be a lot more than we're going to be able to handle in the long term. The system, the slack in the system is pretty tight right now. And I think an over-rotation on just intermittent resources has put us a bit at risk. We haven't focused about reliability so much, and these are exactly the kinds of resources that are going to expose that gap in thinking. So that's what we're confronting. That's why gas is big right now. It's not because somebody wants an emitting resource that's more expensive or something, right? So this stuff is big. It's also dimensionally large in terms of its size. I started my career in the energy business as the general counsel for a company called BECO. It was a big utility in Philadelphia, Philly and the surrounding region. We had, call it about 6 or 7 million people in that area. The biggest commercial customer I had there were the refineries. If you ever fly into Philly, you come from the airport through this very unattractive area of Philadelphia to get to Center City. It's all these refineries. That was about 50 megawatts of load. I ran Commonwealth Edison, which maybe some of you know was the largest utility or 3rd largest utility in the country. It covers Chicago. Talk about 11 million people, all the businesses around that. Biggest customer there were the electric arc steel mill customers. Real pain in my ass, quite honestly, because they're very sensitive to any change in electric feed. But those were 150 megawatts. When you hear guys like Sam Altman talk about Stargate data centers, those are 5,000 megawatts. That's about half of the energy all of New England is using today. And it's not only that amount of energy, which in the aggregate is startling, more than an order of magnitude bigger than any of the customers I've seen in 30 years of the business, but it is also concentrated in one particular area. You guys could imagine what the grid is. It's like all these power plants working together to feed this mesh. It's been distributed, and now it's reconcentrated. So these are creating engineering problems we've never kind of contemplated before. And then if you want to do all that with clean energy in that region, think about dimensionally how big this is. So look, this is gonna strain us in a variety of ways, and utilities and power companies are thinking about it. My parents were immigrants here. When my family came here from Cuba, we marveled at these big companies in the US. And because I'm a lot older than most all of you, I was thinking GM and Ford and US Steel and a whole bunch of companies that aren't even around anymore. Today, my company is, relatively speaking, 3 times the size of Ford Motor Company, twice the size of General Motors, whatever, much bigger than US Steel, quite obviously, given their fortunes. And yet, and the biggest company that we would have thought of in this space, Exxon, is 6 times our size, but the hyperscalers are 40 times larger than Constellation, which could be the largest electric producing company in the world. I mean, think about that. I'm trying to chase a client around that spends an amount of money that is functionally the equivalent of my entire market cap. This thing is transforming everything. There's no utility or power company at scale yet to handle it. That's why we're spending a lot of time talking about it.
Well, and I'm just thinking about, and I know we'll have to wrap up, but I'm just thinking about the last couple of years, what we've seen. You mentioned right at the top, that's the period of time, 4 years, I guess, since you came into the helm of Constellation, and Constellation was spun out. At that point, when I joined the EPRI board, it was all about flat demand and how are we going to manage this sort of, slowly flat, power demand in the power sector. And since then, it's just turned on a dime. And you've been right at the center of that, and Constellation is right at the center of that. It's super exciting to see that, and also really appreciate having your thoughts on what that looks like and how that ride has been so far and where we're going. Please join me in welcoming Joe, and thank you, Joe.